الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the compassionate, the merciful. We ask that He send peace and blessings upon our noble and our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. We begin in the name of the one who created you and I from nothing. We begin in His name, the one who inspired the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, who chose him, who elevated him, who made him the man that he was and is, and the one whom gave him all of the qualities that we praise about him. We praise the Prophet ﷺ ultimately because of the qualities and his essence that the Prophet ﷺ created. And so we began by remembering the one to whom everything returns. And we ask that He send peace and blessings upon our noble and our beloved Prophet ﷺ, whom He chose and elevated and made us of His community. He is the best bounty that could have been given to us. Being from the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, his community is totally mahad fadl. It's totally a bounty from Allah. There's nothing you and I did or do that we are deserving of it. And as the Prophet ﷺ has said, if one isn't thankful, God forbid, they can have those bounties and those blessings that have been given to them removed. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He send peace and blessings upon our noble and our beloved Prophet ﷺ, as is befitting of his rank, and manifesting our thanks and our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for having us be of His community. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He send peace and blessings upon our noble and our beloved Prophet ﷺ, that purifies us inwardly and outwardly. Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meld our intentions with the intentions of our pious predecessors, particularly with the intentions of the compiler of this text, and who he abridged his compilation from, and who he abridged his compilation from. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam ajma'een. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Sheikh Abdul Kareem asked me to narrate to you and to teach from this text that we'll be covering today. You should all have basically just the Al-Hadith that are put together. I put them together, and some of the translation, most of it is from Amjad. We typed up the Arabic and put that there. And then you should also have the syllabus, right, that we won't go over together in class. And we're going to cover about half of the Al-Hadith. So about 30 out of about 59. And then, depending on what happens next semester, we might do another Aqidah class and then finish the other 30 after that, depending on what Sheikh Abdul Kareem prefers. So you should have that. I'm also going to email you, we're not going to print it, a commentary on the hadith that Sidi Amjad Tarsin translated. And he's agreed to have us have access to that, but please don't share it with like random other people. It's not published or anything, but we didn't print that, right? One of the reasons is, as Sheikh Abdul Kareem mentioned, it's important that you write. I'm not going to be just reading from it, but even if I were to read from it, sometimes you'll have the teacher sitting in front of a commentary and you're reading from the actual epistle. And if you sit there and you follow with the commentary, and you're not writing and you're not doing this thing, you won't grasp as much, right? So that was purposeful that we didn't print it. But you have access to it, and if you want to print it, go ahead, inshallah, and we'll add to it, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So this book, or this compilation, is 59 ahadith. And the name of the book is Mukhtar Al-Hadith Al-Sharif, right? The selected is how Amjad translated it. The selected noble transmissions, or the selected noble hadith. And it's really a abridgment. In other words, the author, who we'll talk about in a second, he went to another compilation of hadith and he selected from it certain hadith, right? And that text is called Shifa al-Saqim. It has multiple names, but the well-known name is Shifa al-Saqim, the cure for the ill, right? Or the ill individual. And that was compiled by this author, who we'll talk about, or this compiler's teacher. But that was actually an abridgment of Imam al-Suyuti's text. Jami' al-Saghir. So it's multiple abridgments. And we'll talk about why they abridged it and what we're supposed to do here, inshallah, in a moment. But just so that you understand what's going on. So the original text, or excuse me, the text that our author compiled from was compiled by Imam al-Habib Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Haddar. Muhammad al-Haddar, who is the teacher of Al-Habib Umar, who compiled the text that we are going to be reading from. Right? And the compiler is obviously the one who's selecting the hadith and then just ordering them, selecting which ones he wants or she wants, and then ordering them. Right? Obviously the words are the words of the Prophet ﷺ, and the names of the narrators and who the individuals were, or where the original hadith were found in their compilations. And as we teach this text, we'll probably do about 2 to 3 hadith every session. So we get through about 30. And we'll try to add other hadith commentaries that have been mentioned on those hadith. And then just maybe add a few technical terms to your understanding of how hadith literature works and how the religion works. We can't do it all at once because you'll get overwhelmed and it will be difficult to grasp. So maybe every couple of classes we'll add some terminology so that you can understand that and you can grow and I can grow together. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So his name is Al-Habib Muhammad al-Haddar, excuse me, who passed away, Allah yarhamu. And as we said, that text, Shifa al-Saqim, was an abridgment of Al-Jami' al-Saghir of Imam al-Suyuti, who died in the year 911 Hijrah. So why did Habib Muhammad, why did he choose the 360 odd hadith that he abridged from Imam al-Suyuti's work? So he actually says in his introduction to his compilation, which we're not reading from, he says that I chose ones that were short and easy to memorize. That after a student would learn a little bit of the Quran or memorize some of the Quran, that these words, being the words of the Prophet ﷺ, were the most important to learn and understand. And he said, I chose ones that had a particular light that the student can benefit from. And he said something that Shaykh Abdul Karim also alluded to just now, that some of these hadith that are short are more beneficial than maybe necessarily ones that are longer than them, because of the meaning that it contains, although all of them are good. Just like, as Shaykh Abdul Karim was mentioning in another context, that some of the smaller books that seem almost insignificant to the one who doesn't have inner sight are more important than the longer texts. And, you know, obviously people learn differently, but for me, what Shaykh Abdul Karim said at the end of that session right there, I can't agree more from my personal experience, that taking a small text and then another small text and another small text and another small text, nothing was as useful for me as a student, and I still remain a student, than that, right? A lot of times as American Western students, we want quantity over quality. And I've seen that all the time, and I personally experienced it, where you want to rush through the material. Why are we learning this again? Didn't we take this before, right? But the point is that it's not about quantity. It's about application and guidance, right? The Quran, nobody would say that about the Quran, right? Because people have enough adab not to say that about the Quran. We're going to recite the same verses again, right? But we, for some reason, think that the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, whether they're in ahadith or their laws or their beliefs, that somehow that is that same type of rule doesn't apply. It doesn't have the same nobility as the Quran does, but it's the light is emanating from the same ocean, right? All of that's emanating from the same ocean, right? Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is creating that guidance for us, right? So these are all things to keep in mind. The other thing that Imam Al-Habib Muhammad al-Haddar had mentioned is he said that it would kind of almost, if I can maybe put it in this way, get your beak wet, so you'll want to increase in knowledge, right? These are a hadith that will guide you to want to learn more. And he narrates for us, or he refers to and he alludes to in the opening introduction, a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that he says, and this isn't one of the hadith, but it's in his introduction. He said that the believer will not be satiated from good that he hears until his end is heaven. The believer will not be satiated from the good that he hears until his end is the heavenly realm. Okay, so that's a good introduction. And Al-Habib Umar, who's visited, thankfully, Michigan, and is the principal head of the school where Sheikh Abdul Karim spent more than a decade and was in his company. He's the one who then compiled and abridged from Imam al-Haddar's work, and that's where we're starting. So before we start with the first hadith, we're going to cover a few things that are important to know. So, before you studied some law, you studied some belief and aqidah, you studied some tafsir, you're going to study some seerah, inshallah. And right now you're studying a science that revolves around hadith. But the hadith sciences are numerous. And so there's not just one. There are two principal breakdowns that they break them into. But it's actually more than just that. So one is specific, and it's called a-riwaya. And the other one is called a-diraya. And what we're focusing on and what we'll be concerning ourselves with is riwaya, transmission. Right? And we'll talk about what that means. So if one asks, what is ilm al-hadith bil-riwaya? What is the knowledge or the science of hadith in transmission? Remember, you got used to this. If you're new, you might say, oh my gosh, this is so specific, right? But the scholars, they were very specific. And they spent their entire lives dedicated to mastering these disciplines and benefiting from them and benefiting our ummah through them. And they took it serious. And they didn't do it, as I'm sitting here in front of this screen, they didn't do it in front of $1,000 machines in, warm climates that are benefiting by heat and, having delicious foods. But they did it through hard work on very little because they cared about this religion and they gave everything that they could for its sake. And inshallah, if we struggle a little bit, inshallah, we'll maybe benefit even a medium amount of light from what they did. So they said that this knowledge it includes or it encompasses the sayings of the Prophet. So that's one. His actions, his character traits or his attributes. His tacit approvals. And then it also includes the transmission of those things, the precision regarding it, and to understand the meanings. So it just enumerated all of the things that fall under the science of the ilm of hadith in riwayah. Because there's ilm al-hadith fi diraya, right? So under this subheading, the following are enumerated. I'll repeat it again. It includes the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, his actions, his attributes. It's a tough one to translate. It's not just attributes, but awsafihi. Tacit approvals. And then also the transmission of those things and the precision regarding them. And finally, to understand the meanings of the words. They call all of that ilm al-hadith bil-riwaya. So where do we get all of that? Well, this might seem pretty obvious, but we'll say it. We get it all from the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, his actions, his tacit approvals. And also from his not saying things when incidents occurred in front of him, which falls under the idea of tacit approval or concept of tacit approval. His not chastising somebody or mentioning that what they did was wrong in his presence. Right? Or hearing about things that happened in his absence and then not saying anything about it. Also, they look at it another way and they say that the subject of this science is the essence of the Prophet ﷺ, from the vantage point of his sayings, his actions, his attributes, his tacit approvals, and his character. What is some of the benefit from learning this discipline? Well, it's to protect oneself from making errors in transmitting the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, transmitting his actions and his tacit approvals and his character. You don't want to say wrong things about the Prophet ﷺ. And we live in times where people just say whatever they want about the Prophet ﷺ. They don't even have to have proof. They just say, oh, the Prophet did this. They might not know that he did that. It might be a projection of their own self than who the Prophet ﷺ was. Right? The goal, what's the aim? Well, it's felicity in both lives. In this life and the next life. And then what is its unique trait? What's the blessing of learning it? Well, it's the best of sciences. And you'll hear that actually in a lot of the disciplines. But it is one of the best of sciences, and it is of the best. Because through it, you know how to follow the Prophet ﷺ and what he's ordered us to do. That's a pretty good, solid reason for why it's the best of disciplines. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says at the end of the verse, وَاتَّبِعُوهُ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَهْتَدُونَ, and follow him so that you may be guided. And the verse that we are always mentioning to you, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهُ. Tell them, O Messenger of God, that if they claim to love Allah, to follow you, and Allah will love them. What's also important to know is that the Prophet ﷺ didn't speak from whim. He didn't speak from caprice. The Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words, pre-eternal speech, says about the Prophet ﷺ that he doesn't speak from whim. مَا يَنْتَقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about him. That he doesn't speak from whim. وَإِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. Nay, it is no other, if you want to, in a rough meaning of it, than revelation or inspiration from your Lord. Right? And if you were with us during the Aqidah section, there were multiple definitions to the word Quran that we gave you. But one of the, I think in my opinion, the easier definitions to remember, it's not as precise, but it's easier, is that which was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and he informed us is Quran. It's the speech of Allah, pre-eternal. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ said a lot of things. Certain things that he said, this is from Allah, this is Quran. Right? And that is the word of Allah. It's not the word of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? And other times he said things from Allah and he didn't say it's Quran. And other times he said things from himself, but it's inspiration from Allah. Right? So as you learn these sciences, you'll see how they integrate with one another and how important they are. But the main thing that I wanted to clarify there is that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, he doesn't speak from whim. Right? It's inspired by Allah. Everything he said. The Prophet ﷺ is narrated to have said, نَضَّرَ اللَّهُ إِمْرَأً سَمِعَ مَقَالَتِي فَبَلَّغَهَا فَرُبَّ حَامِلِ فِقْهٍ غَيْرِ فَقِيهٍ وَرُبَّ حَامِلِ فِقْهٍ إِلَى مَنْ هُوَ أَفْقَهُ مِنْ. So this word naddara, they translate it in many ways, but one of the ways illuminated. So Allah illuminates the individual who hears something I've said and it reaches him and he carries it over or tells someone else about it. So the Prophet ﷺ continues to say, perhaps one carries a knowledge, but he doesn't understand it. And perhaps somebody carries a knowledge to someone who's more knowledgeable than them. Right? So sometimes people are carrying knowledge, but they don't necessarily are getting its full benefit. Doesn't mean they're getting zero benefit, but they maybe don't understand it. One of the easiest ways to understand this is somebody who memorizes the entire Quran. We have, alhamdulillah, many, many of them, and may Allah increase them, who maybe don't even speak Arabic. They know some of its meanings, and it's still a huge benefit for them. It's a huge light, right? And it's a huge act of worship, right? And reverence to the Quran. And it's one of them, I think, the miracles of this religion, really. You know, somebody will memorize the entire Quran and not speak Arabic, right? But they might recite the Quran to somebody in front of them who's a grammarian or a morphologist or expert in Arabic and different disciplines, and they might understand more of what's being said than the one who's reciting, right? This is what the Prophet ﷺ said. And, you know, this is important to know because you are, and I am, hearing and reading the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ said, convey from me even one ayah, one sign or one hadith, or something about me that you know. So you're going to benefit from it even if you don't fully understand it and you convey it to someone else. And what Shaykh Abdul Karim, I believe, you know, hopefully I wasn't mistaken, what he was trying to allude to before is having more hands, is like, there's constantly this mentioning of like, well, you know, we need to be interacting with this group and that group, and there's these people that need help. But the thing is, there's so few people, right? And so we need everyone, including the people in this room and the people that you know, to be working in the da'wah. It's not just for Shaykh Abdul Karim, right? Alhamdulillah, we're blessed with him and his family, but he cannot give da'wah to every single person in Michigan, right? So everyone's got to kind of play their role. And it's not that only the scholar is the one who conveys the message, right? And I was thinking actually about what he said yesterday. I didn't fully grasp it, and that happens quite often. You know, he was saying, somebody brought up this point at the halaqah about, well, there's individuals that don't feel as comfortable coming. And that's true. There's always going to be individuals that don't feel comfortable coming to a certain gathering. But the individual, I think, was alluding to the fact that we need to go out there more, especially to non-Muslims. And what Shaykh Abdul Karim said was, you know, he's like, you know, well, people, we all interact with non-Muslims. And I didn't fully grasp it. And then even I mentioned it to him in the car again with Brad. And he said, you know, I don't know. The reality is we all interact. And I didn't really, I mean, I know we interact with non-Muslims, but I wasn't grasping it. But then when I got home, I kind of thought about it. I was like, yeah, honestly, like, we all interact with non-Muslims so much. So why are we waiting until there's an event where we interact with non-Muslims? Like, why does that the da'wah? What about the everyday that we interact all the time with non-Muslims, right? So I thought it was honestly really, really hit me. But the point is, you know, we're learning about the Prophet ﷺ. It should benefit us, but also it can benefit other people. All right. Then I have some other hadith that I want to share with you before we start. Bismillah, we do have some time. The Prophet ﷺ said in one narration, "O Allah, have mercy on my stewards, my khalifas." So the Sahaba said, "O Messenger of Allah, who are your khalifas?" The Prophet ﷺ said, "The ones who come after me, they narrate my transmissions, my hadith and my sunnah, and they teach the people." They teach the people. And the Prophet ﷺ has a well-known hadith, and there's two variations of it. I've heard, you know, I'm not a hadith scholar, so I've heard that both of them, some say one is stronger than the other. I've heard the old Mufti of Egypt say that the one with the family, the Prophet ﷺ, is stronger. But he said that I left for you two things. If you hold on to them, you'll never be misguided after I pass, right after me. And it's the book of Allah, and then the two different hadiths, there's two different transmissions of what comes second. One is my sunnah, and then one is my family, right? And Dr. Ali said that actually the one with Ahl al-Bayt is stronger, although I've heard the opposite as well. But the point is, they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, what they say is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is best characterized in the scholars that act on that knowledge from the family of the Prophet ﷺ, right? And we were mentioning in the class of Risala al-Jami'ah, and I really thought about this more, actually, not because of that, but because of at the event that we had on Monday with Dr. Ware and Sheikh Mohammed Mendez, and they're talking about Senegal and some of the knowledge practices in Senegal, and how like one family for like 800 years, their career was they're all scholars, right? And just think about if everybody in your family was a doctor for the last like 800 years. Think about kind of that institutional knowledge of how to be a doctor, right? So they're talking about Senegal. So I was like thinking about it, and I mean, and there's a lot of things I love about Hadramaut, but I thought I was like, man, like Habib Ahmed, the author of that text, like all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. Every single person in his line could tell you his dad and his dad's dad, all the way back to the Prophet. Every single one of them was a scholar, right? And you see that, and it's really beautiful. I mean, it's good for other people to join scholarship too, but there's something about that, right? There's something about the purveyors of that knowledge, and the family of the Prophet ﷺ particularly, because they took from him in blood, right? And the descendants that were in that scholarship line, there's a huge amount of benefit in that, right? And there's a huge benefit and blessing to being in the family of the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, we're not saying, I know right away with like Westerners particularly, the first thing is like, well, you know, but if you're bad, you know, okay, that's right. We're not saying that it gets you into heaven alone, right? What we're saying is everyone's got to do their work, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is what gets people into heaven. But there's a blessing to being of the family of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and we should show them reverence. And the Prophet ﷺ said in a well-known hadith, he said, love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of the bounties that you receive from him, and love me out of his love for me, and love my family out of your love for me, right? So that's part of our religion. People don't want that. I don't know what religion they're following. Okay, so who was the first one to really start to look at this as a discipline and compile it? Well, you know, first, so you don't misunderstand, obviously, these hadith go all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. So it goes all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ. But what we're talking about it is more from a disciplinary stand, right? So when you studied law, obviously the Prophet ﷺ taught people how to pray. So you could say it started with the Prophet ﷺ, but what they meant was who were the first kind of major compilers of the law, right? With Aqidah, it's the same thing. All of the disciplines go back to the Prophet ﷺ, right? He's the ocean, right? So they say that the first was Muhammad ibn Muslim ibn Ubaidullah ibn Abdullah ibn Shihab al-Zuhri al-Madani. And he died at around 124 of the Hijrah. And they say that Amir al-Mu'minina, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, actually commanded him to work on compilation. So that does not mean, so you don't misunderstand, that people didn't compile the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ before that. That's not what that means, right? But they basically have to start with where is the starting point of this discipline. So they've chosen, I'm not qualified enough to fully grasp their choices, of where they have their starting point. Even at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, people were writing down ahadith, right? Many ahadith, right? That we have from them. All right. So after that period, another group of scholars came, right? And they started to separate the hadith according to chapters. And they also included in these codexes the sayings of the companions and the fatwas of those who came after the companions, that's tabi'in. So it's not the way we understand Bukhari to be, right? Which we'll talk about here in a second. But at first, they didn't think of it that way. And it's hard for us to understand this because like hindsight's 20/20. You understand, the first people who were taking the Prophet ﷺ, they were just memorizing what he was saying. And early on, there's evidence that the Prophet ﷺ actually forbade them at first to write down what wasn't Quran. Some of the wisdoms they say is because they didn't want people to mix up. But later, the Prophet ﷺ allowed it and encouraged people to write it down, right? At this period, people were just compiling things. And you can think about it as, okay, the Prophet ﷺ lived 100, 200 years before them, and they wanted to take as much knowledge as they could other than the Quran. So they were taking hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. They were taking sayings of the companions. They were taking fatwas of the tabi'een, right? And they were compiling it like, this is the book, right? These are the books that all the guidance is in, right? And this is how they compiled it for a period, right? Then another period came in which some of the scholars began to only compile books that were from the Prophet, the only hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, right? And then, not finally, but then the period that most people are aware of, right, came the period of Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, who we'll talk about, inshallah, a little bit more in our next session, and their history and what time they lived. Assalamu alaikum. And so in their period, they began to differentiate between different levels of veracity, not that the scholars before didn't know that, but that they literally took their book and said, I'm going to put only in this book what I view as sahih, right? And as far as we know, nobody before Imam al-Bukhari had attempted to do that, right? So again, don't misunderstand that they didn't know what was authentic and what wasn't authentic. They knew that, and they had their own disciplines for dealing with that. Just like they knew how to pray before Imam al-Shafi'i came, before Imam Malik came, right? But the disciplines developed this way, right? And as I was mentioning to the brothers and sisters in the room next door earlier, I mean, this religion has been maintained as it was for 1,400 years. And the guardians of that are the scholars. The guardians of that are the family of the Prophet ﷺ who act on their knowledge. They're the guardians, right? I mean, think about Arabic, because this is really easy. The Quran, if you recite Quran to an educated, in the Arab world Arab, they will understand at a shallow level, you know, I mean, you can't make up a percentage, but large percentages of the Quran, right? Not going to know the deeper level and what it means, but they'll understand. If you recite Shakespeare in its tongue, now to us, we will not understand it. That was only like, what, a few hundred years ago. So who outwardly is Allah, obviously, is the one who does everything, but who outwardly was the one who's protecting the Arabic language from that happening to it? Not because that's evil in and of itself, but they wanted to keep the Arabs connected to the Quran. So whether the Arabs liked it or not, they were learning all this stuff that they're like, God, we don't even speak like this anymore. But they had to learn it because the scholars wanted to make sure that they would have a connection with the Quran, right? And so until our day, there are scholars who are keeping the teaching of this religion alive so that people still know how to pray. And isn't it amazing that like people pray now as the Prophet ﷺ prayed? And they make wudu now as the Prophet ﷺ made wudu. And they recite words now that we know the Prophet ﷺ said, right? And even in the academy, which most of it, especially in Near Eastern studies, although it's changed quite a bit, but its origins were anti-Islam. Like when they were teaching from a vantage point where they wanted to really destroy the religion, right? Especially in the last few hundred years. And then recently it's changed quite a bit. There's some reform, but it's not necessarily great. Even at that level, nobody in the academy that's actually respectable claims that the Quran is different than what the Prophet ﷺ said was Quran. And even when some of the scholars early on tried to critique it, not even that long ago, Patricia Crona and them, the other non-Muslim scholars said, look, your scholarship is really poor. And like, we don't really have any proof. Like I remember in our class, I won't name the professor. I was in this class, it's really bad. But just to show you the this is not a believer. You could tell that he liked Islam, but not really kind of from a belief standpoint. Allah knows what's in his heart. You know, he told the class of non-Muslims, he said, look, as far as we know, the Quran is from the Prophet, right? From this individual named Muhammad, alayhi salatu was-salam. But they don't let us into there to see, to excavate. Maybe if we excavated things, we'd find other things. But we can't really find any holes, right? And you got to think, they've been trying for a really long time, right? And they haven't been able to find any holes. And so this is really important. And I've shared this story with you, but I'll share it with you again because it goes hand in hand. That when we were in Egypt, we were at a Jumu'ah at Sultan Hassan. And the scholar who was giving khutbah, he gave this khutbah around the time of Hajj, and he was saying, you know, Hajj, Mecca, there's another language in Arabic, and it's referred to in the Quran as Bekka. They switched the meme and the ba. He said, you know, it's in the Bible. Prophets have always made pilgrimage here. So then he comes the next week, and he says, you know, after I left the khutbah, one of my students came up to me and he said, you know, I have a Coptic friend, and he told me that Bekka's not in the Bible. So he said, you know, Sheikh, why did you say it if it's not there? So he said, I did a little bit of research. He's like, well, wouldn't you know that it's in every version of the Bible but Arabic? And then he just looked at the audience and he said, Alhamdulillah that we're Muslims. And he didn't connect the dots for you, but why is it only missing from the Arabic version, right? And so our scholars, alhamdulillah, for the most part, they were so adamant that they revealed this religion as it was revealed to them, that even the arguments that they don't agree with are still maintained, right? Like, how many Mu'tazilis do you still know? Not very many, but all their arguments are in the books. They didn't delete them. The narrations of the Quran, we have 10 that you can use in worship, right? The 10 chains. But even the few other ones that we have, they're still there. They didn't say like, oh, let's hide these, right? They're still there. Because it's an amana, it's a trust. Like, why would they're not allowed to delete things. They can give their opinion about it, right? So our religion, that's the way it was transmitted. So when we're looking at these hadith, these are transmitted by individuals, and we'll talk about it a little bit in the future, but who had the strongest concern for the trust of what they were transmitting to us, right? And they have systems of understanding that and disciplines that literally no other civilization has created, right? For example, what civilization do you know, at least I don't know, maybe there is and I don't know it, where they ask you about the person who's teaching you about their etiquette and their virtue. And if they have like character traits that are not virtuous, they can throw out everything that they said. Because they're like, why should we trust him? Like, he was stealing the other day, right? But for us, it's kind of like, oh, he has a degree, you know, he wrote it in a book, so maybe it's true, right? So there's entire disciplines that rotated around this, and that's really important. So we're running out of time, so let's start, inshallah, with the text. And we have till, pretty sure it's 3:15, but I just want to check. We have till 3:15, so maybe we could take 5 more minutes. Okay. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam ajma'in. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى فمن كانت هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله ومن كانت هجرته لدنيا يصيبها أو امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه رواه البخاري ومسلم. No, or do you not have it with you? Can you read the English for us, please?
The messenger of God, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allah bless him and give him peace, said, verily actions are according to their intentions, and for every person is that which they intended. Thus, whose immigration was for God and his messenger, then his immigration was for God and his messenger. And whose immigration was for a worldly affair or intending a woman's hand, then his immigration was for that which he immigrated.
Al-Bukhari and Muslim narrated. Okay, this is actually narrated in slightly different wording by many other of the hadith narrators and compilers, including the Tirmidhi and Abu Dawud and the Nasa'i. And Imam al-Nawawi, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him, the one who unfortunately recently some of, Allahu alam who they are, I don't know who they are, they blew up his grave site supposedly out of religiosity. He says about this hadith in the compilation of Imam Muslim, he says all of the Muslims, they admit or they give witness to the reverence or the level of magnificence of this hadith and its many benefits and its authenticity. Imam al-Shafi'i said, and others, it's a third of Islam. Imam al-Shafi'i said that you can get 70 doors of law out of it, right? Some said it's a fourth of Islam. Right? So they saw a lot of benefit in it. Right? And some of the scholars of Hadith always began their books with it because of its importance, including Imam al-Bukhari. So we're going to look at it a couple different ways, right? One way is to look at some of the words. So intention here is a word used for purpose. The purpose. In the sacred law, intention is the purpose of a thing coupled with its action. And one of the wisdoms here is it differentiates custom from action. So if a person goes into the shower, because we have water so readily available, because they just got up and they don't think about what they're doing, versus somebody who goes into the shower and they intend ghusl, right? It's a big difference. And this phrase, actions are only, carries some possibilities. One is that the soundness of the actions are only by the intention. Or actions are rendered sound by their intentions. Or an action is only accepted by its intention. Or the perfection of action is through its intention. And then the Prophet ﷺ also used the word migration or immigration. And here the commentators seem to believe that it refers to the well-known migration of the Prophet ﷺ from Mecca to Medina in the 13th year of his prophecy. ﷺ. And some of the narrators believe that he was referencing an actual individual who had migrated for other than Allah and His Messenger, for a woman named Qais to marry. And they used to call him the one who migrated for Qais. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, verily actions are according to their intentions. And for every person is that which they intended. Those who migrated for, that's right, those whose migration was for God and His Messenger, then his migration was for God and His Messenger. And those whose migration was for a worldly affair or intending a woman's hand, then his migration was for that which he migrated, right? Right. So the intention is the desire to perform an act followed by an attempt to perform it. And migration also means leaving a place where it is extremely difficult to practice Islam openly to another place where one can practice Islam freely. That's all good, inshallah. So this hadith teaches that the soundness of one's actions depends upon the intention behind it. In other words, actions cannot be considered worthy of receiving reward unless they are backed by the proper intention. In addition, one's portion of reward is received according to his intention. If one has a pious intention, the action will be virtuous, and that person will receive reward. If one has an evil intention, the action will be damaging, and that person will incur sin. Finally, if one intends an action for a worldly reason, they receive no reward. Right? And in concomitance with our lesson on Aqeedah, we learned that Allah creates both the slave and their action. Okay, good. So, and we acquire our actions by intentions. Right? So Allah creates us and our actions. Then you say, well, how are we judged? Well, we acquire it by our intentions. Right? And intentions, they say, are eternal unless they change later. So if you die and your intentions forever, God forbid, to do sin, then you'll be judged according to that. Right? Okay. So here the hadith is focusing really on the concept of ikhlas, sincerity, which Shaykh Abdul Karim's translated for you, or defined for you multiple times. And that's acting for God alone. Acting for God alone. So the main point that you can take away from the hadith is that we act for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messengers. That's the main purpose of our life. The obligatory, remember there's 5 categories. Those who were just with us in class, they already got it again. But there are 5 categories in the law, right? Generally accepted as 5. The obligatory, the recommended, the permissible, the disliked, and the prohibited, right? Intention affects all of them but the forbidden. So what does that mean? That means you could do something obligatory for a bad intention and receive sin for it. So what? Prayer. You come in to pray, but you're praying because you wanted to hide from the police because you are intending to rob some bank. Right? It's a really convoluted reason, but that's something forbidden. Something maybe more obvious. You came to the mosque to pray dhuhr, which is obligatory, but you actually didn't come to pray. You came so people could say, look at this religious guy, right? It also affects the recommended. You could do something recommended that you could technically receive reward for if done right, but you could get sin for it. The permissible, you could receive reward or sin for it. The disliked, the only one it doesn't affect is the forbidden. And this is one that a lot of people slip up on. They say, but I did it for the right reason. But that's not how it works, right? So you can't, drink alcohol, right? So that you can get close to your coworkers, so that you can tell them about Islam, right? Not allowed. Maybe that one's a little far-fetched, but we get it a lot when it comes to like intermixing between the genders, right? Oh, it's okay because we're just talking about the religion, right? If it crosses the lines, it crosses the lines, right? So this is important, and inshallah, you're all intelligent people, and you got that. Okay, so we have a little bit of time, so let's inshallah keep going. Right, we can skip that. All right, so here we go. So the Prophet ﷺ is narrated to have said that Allah has written good deeds and bad deeds. Then he clarified that. So whoever attempts to perform a good deed and that he doesn't do it, Allah writes for him as a good deed, a complete good deed. And anyone who intends or sets out to do a good deed and does it, Allah will write it for him as 10 good deeds, all the way up to 700 times that, to many times or many multiples more. Okay? So if you set out to do a good deed, but then you don't do it, you get at least one point, right? It doesn't count as points, but if you set out to do a good deed, then you do it. So the minimum you're going to get is 10, but up to 700. Multiples and multiples of that, right? A lot. And then whoever intends to do a bad deed, but then doesn't do it, Allah writes it for him as a good deed, completely. A complete good deed. But if he attempts to do a bad deed, or he drives to do a bad deed, and then he does it, Allah only writes it as one bad deed. So Allah's justice never oppresses his servants and his slaves. If he wanted to, he could do anything he wanted with us, right? Because there's no injustice to the one who owns us, created us from nothing. But he gave us this way, and he told us this is how he would judge us. And then his mercy just forgives over and over and over again, right? Nobody's deserving of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's reward. All right, this is getting to the hadith that's useful / scary. Okay. All right, so then the Prophet ﷺ is also narrated to have said, this ummah is like 4 different people. A man who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given wealth. So he acts according with his knowledge. And he spends its due, or its right, meaning in good. So that's one person. Then another man who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given knowledge, but he didn't give him wealth. And that man says, the second man, if I had wealth like that first individual, I would have done as he had done. That the Prophet ﷺ said, both of these individuals receive the same type of reward. So it's an individual who has wealth and knowledge. He spends his wealth in accordance with his knowledge. The second individual has knowledge, no wealth. But he says, had I had wealth like that first person, I would have done the same good deeds they did. And the Prophet ﷺ said both of them receive the exact same type of reward. Okay. Then the Prophet ﷺ goes on to the part that's scarier for us. Right? And another man who the Prophet ﷺ gave wealth, but he didn't give him knowledge. So he basically slams against one another, or he misuses his wealth in other than its due. Right? And then a fourth man who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give knowledge and did not give wealth. And he says, had I had wealth, I would have done like the third person and I would have spent it inappropriately. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said in regard to this, both of them receive the same amount of sin. right? So how does this work? Because a lot of people, I think, misunderstand that hadith before about, not doing it, etc. It depends on whether you're not doing it because you've decided not to versus Allah stopped you, right? So in other words, if you just can't, you don't have the will, you don't have the resources to commit the sin, that's not you stopping yourself, right? That's Allah stopping you, right? Maybe something more visible, tangible will help you. If you went to punch your friend in the face and Allah caused your hand to just fall, right, miraculously, you intended to punch him. That's why the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, he says, if two Muslims fight trying to kill one another, both the killed and the killer are in the hellfire. And they said, well, we understand the one who killed, but why the one who killed the other, but why the one who was killed? And he said, well, he wanted to kill the other individual, didn't he? Like that was his intention, right? So this is really dangerous as knowledge for us because we're constantly in our technology, constantly watching and inundating ourselves with what other people have, and a lot of those people, they're using their wealth in very, very negative, evil ways. And then we're saying, even if we don't say it publicly, I kind of wish I had that, right? And some of these artists, they actually get on their CDs and MP3s and they're telling us, this is what I have and this is what I get to do. And like, don't you wish you were like me, right? The answer should be no, right? You shouldn't be listening to them and you shouldn't be wanting to do what they're doing, right? But the good news is that the Prophet ﷺ told us that if we, had good intentions, then we receive reward for that, bi'idhnillah. Okay, we got to wrap up because we're running out of time. So the last few things that we can share with you. This hadith inspires within one desire to take part in great and virtuous acts. The Prophet ﷺ said when teaching about intentions, an example of one of the greatest sacrifices and beloved acts to God exalted is he, which is migration for God and his messenger. Therefore, a Muslim should also aspire and intend to perform great acts of worship for God the exalted. Right? It's a great act to migrate for Allah. It teaches one to have sincerity in all actions. Know that God comes between a man and his heart, that you will be gathered to him. It motivates one to work for the religion. It shows the actions are not always in reality what is done outwardly. The intentions that propel those actions play a key role in debasing or elevating the servant. Great. And lastly, but not least, before we take actions, before we take questions, we won't cover them, but the hadith, in the first couple of people that narrate it, there's only one individual, first few. So it became popular after about 3 or 4 people down the chain. We'll talk about chains and the actual content, inshallah, as we go forward. But the point is, it wasn't immediately narrated by tons of Sahaba, but after it got to a certain point in the chain, it became a very popular hadith. And its chain is sound, and it's very well known, right? And its meaning, as you can see, Imam Shafi'i said, it's a third of the religion, right? And so this is a hadith that it's important to know. It's well memorized. Many people have it memorized. If you can memorize it, great. If you can't memorize it, at least learn its meaning. بإذن الله تعالى. الحمد لله رب العالمين. صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله.